All right, thank you. Thank you, Jude, and welcome everybody. Good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. So on my ride over to the hotel, I'm having a conversation with the Uber driver because I basically talk to just about everybody. And so when he was asking me, what I was doing, he's like, "Oh, you're dressed nice. What are you headed to do?" I told him what I was coming here to give a brief address about judicial management and how the courts kind of manage their way through COVID-19. And as you probably all of you know, whenever you tell somebody you work for the courts, everybody has a story, right? So he said, "Oh, my son just graduated law school. He got married. He's working in the district attorney's office in Fresno. And if you know anything about California, that's the place to be." He goes, "But I got to hand it to you people in the courts." He said, "You don't have plenty of money, but you have plenty of stories." And so that's the kind of reminded me of this session a little bit, because that's what this session really is going to be essentially about. Excuse me. Give us 1 second, some technical difficulty. So it's not moving. Is it because they put this in? Yeah. Okay, so our session is basically going to talk about, we're going to try to accomplish in this short time together 3 objectives. So we're going to talk about, my colleague here, Collins, will talk to you about reviewing the basic framework of what went into essentially our continuity operations plan as we were planning for Ebola in the state of New Jersey, and how we utilized that COOP plan, and it was then fully operationalized into assessing some of the critical decision-making points and the strategic management issues that went into COVID-19 once that sort of fully hit. And then we're going to conclude with talking about some of the universal lessons that we've learned through that process. First, developing that conceptual framework and sort of using it as a benchmark for what we were going to do with COVID-19, and talking about the operationalization of that management in COVID-19.
Good morning. So, in case you're wondering why we're doing this, first, I didn't expect that I would be doing it at 7 o'clock in the morning. I saw Jude yesterday evening. I said, "Jude, why did you do this to us?" She says, "Don't tell anybody, but you guys are the warm-up for the main event." And I think I'm the warm-up for Joe, who's going to do the rest of the speaking. But I was, I don't know, a couple of months ago, I think I was in Dubai, and I got a call from Joe, who's a busybody, always looking for something to do. He says, "Collins, I want us to do something at the NECOM." I said, "What do you want us to do this time?" "Why don't we do something about the COOP plan that we were working on for years and how it prepared the judiciary for the COVID-19 situation?" I said, "Not again." And the reason I said that was, it's like all my life in the judiciary, I was always doing some COOP plan or the other. I joined the court system in Essex County in New Jersey back in 1983. And that's not far away from the civil unrest that took place in Newark, if some of you were born then in the 60s and 70s. So we were always worried about one unrest after the other. Every summer we had to prepare for jail overcrowding, riots in the jail, prepared for flood, fire, bomb threats, were regular incidents. And then the 9/11. 9/11 was just in New York City, across the river from us. I was already in my office by 7 o'clock in the morning. Somebody ran into my office and said one of the towers had been hit. So I walked a few minutes into the law library that was adjacent to my office to take a picture. You could see the towers from the windows. As I was looking, I saw the second plane going, and it actually happened before my eyes. And if you know what happens with the first responders, when something goes wrong somewhere, all of them go in that direction. So I looked around. The courts, the security in our courts is being provided by the sheriff department, and the sheriff is an elected official. So what do you think they did on 9/11? Packed up their stuff, and they were heading to New York City, leaving the courts by itself. Can't tell you what since I'm on live TV, can't tell you what I did. But that was the beginning of a serious COOP plan. We went from the little events to thinking about how do we keep the court running for 5 days, for 10 days, if things go wrong. And then we had the avian flu. I think Jude and I were in Chicago getting ready for the avian flu, which it was an epidemic. It never really got into a pandemic. And then the Ebola, which I worked with Joe. Joe was already working in the Judiciary with me at the time. He was the head of the COOP plan for me. And this, now, you may not be interested in this, but this is basically the story. 8,000 known cases at the time. That was in 2014. People were dying. I think the Ebola was in Zaire and South Sudan, some part of Congo. But by October 23rd, 2014, this doctor, Craig, who was out there helping them, got the disease. A few days later, the nurse got the disease, all in Newark. You'll go to the next slide. The reason we're sharing this information is just so you can see the difference between Ebola and COVID. Ebola was more deadly, as you can see. It gets worse when somebody dies. That's how you contact it. But COVID, the spread is much faster. And two different things. What we did was, and we had I think I brought the materials I got from the avian flu, and we had to make our own plan in New Jersey on what to do if it becomes an epidemic in our area and the courts are forced to close, or people's civil liberties are being affected. We had to draw a distinction between quarantine and isolation. There were no bench manuals, there were no public health laws, because up until then we were dealing with different types of crises, election issues, but no public health law. None of our judges were prepared for the issues involved. You know, quarantine is when they think you're exposed, but you're not infected, and you have to be restricted so that you to monitor and see if you're going to get sick. Isolation, people are really deemed to have been infected. Personally, since October last year, I've been I've been quarantined, I don't know, maybe 7 times. Because if you travel, if you continue to travel, you have to be quarantined. Many of the countries have the restrictions. The assumption is if you're in a plane with a bunch of people, you may have been exposed. As soon as you get into that country, they quarantine you. I was quarantined in October in St. Lucia, again in October in St. Martin. End of October, I was quarantined in Nigeria. Then in November, I was quarantined in Dubai, and on and on and on. Recently, I had a client that they were building a new courthouse in Africa, and the elevators that they needed were made in France. They needed to go and see the lifts, as they call them, and France was closed, so the company arranged for my clients to go to Dubai to see inspect the equipment, and I was asked to come along. So I flew into Frankfurt to join the chief judge. And we got into Dubai. Dubai had a policy: when you get off the plane, they'll do another test, rapid test at the airport before you can get into town. I was cleared. The chief judge tested positive, even though he tested negative before he left his country. And they took him into isolation, and they took me into quarantine. And I wasted 7 days before we could do anything. He stayed much longer. He stayed there for 3 weeks. Then they found out he got other issues. So these things are the issues we were trying to address way before COVID-19. And we wanted to see what are the case laws. We had all these things put together. And as I look back now, this was a great list, because if you go to different countries in the world, they don't care about these things. They don't care, if they quarantine you, you're on your own. You can't go to court. It's not the court who makes the decision. Nobody cares whether you can go back to work or not, or you have food to eat. And in Dubai, they asked us, they said, you have a choice. You can go to the public facility where we quarantine everybody, or you can go to the Marriott Hotel reserved for people who can afford to pay. Yeah, guess where I went? Because you don't want to go to where you come out of the place and get sick just because you're with everybody. So I stayed at the Marriott Hotel. But many places in the world they don't have that. When I was quarantined in Nigeria, you're on your own. Just go and stay in the hotel and pay with your own money and your own food. So these were the issues that we put together, the case laws, factors, and in order to prepare our judges. And this is what they have brought forward to also use for the COVID-19. The thing is, in preparing a plan, you gotta think, what are the critical functions, at least that the court, and this is each one of us think about our own environment, our own jurisdiction. What are the essential functions? And how long can you, because one of the issues was, is it for 1 month? Is it for 1 week? Is it for 6 months? You never know. So you have to be nimble enough in your plan to allow for these things to be scaled up or scaled down depending on how long the unrest or the situation will last. And I think these are the lists that we came up with in our own courts at the time. What's the thing about, because I didn't want to talk about, yes, this one. The biggest mistake because once we did our plan, we were asked to share with everybody else in the state. The worst thing you can think of is a judge running away from the scene with his robe on, because the hierarchy in court is, you have the managers, the judges. So it's a tendency to think that if you're having any plan, that this judge should be in charge of this team. We wanted judges to be in charge of their own teams, and they were the first to run. And so just because somebody has a higher position doesn't mean that he or she is qualified to be a leader in a COOP plan. You may find a good leader from a low-level staff, because you don't know what they do when they're not working in courts. They are leaders in their churches. They lead choir groups, committees, and things in real life that they can bring to bear. You can ask me to give a CPR. I don't know how to give a CPR. I would cringe before I do that. And so we had to think. It was a big issue that once we're doing our plans, the various teams, the various groups have to be led by whomever is qualified, not by your position in court. So the other thing that was very important to us is the committee, the group in the jurisdiction. Good communication, identifying the people that you have to work with, and not wait till the unrest of the shutdown before you know who your partners are. We worked to know them, to have meetings with them, to identify what technologies we'll be using, and to identify the proper infrastructure, and to keep meeting, even though we had no issues, but we kept meeting regularly at 2 or 3 times a year, looking at our go bags. We had a bag that, in event of crisis, you take it, you run. But Joe will explain later that part of what we're thinking then is, you can run from your jurisdiction to another jurisdiction, or you can run from your state from New Jersey to Pennsylvania and hold courts from there. But you know what happened in the pandemic? No place to go. The whole world shut down. So we have to come up with a new formula. But this is basically how we. What's that thing there? Stop Ebola.
From Nigeria.
Prevention is your best protection. Yeah. Back then, the people were protesting and spreading fake news back then on Ebola, blaming it on all kinds of things. So it didn't start this with COVID-19, the issues we're having in this country. It was going on then. Because this picture was a public service announcement in Nigeria back then to tell people this is for real, the Ebola is for real, do your own part. Joe, you want to go from there?
Yeah. Okay. So the plan that we put together for Ebola, we didn't know it then, we know it now, that it was used essentially as a platform. I say just as a platform because it was like a base, right? Because a lot of mistakes were made. Because it's like to use kind of like a military analogy, it's like preparing something before you go into battle, right? And then once the artillery starts shooting and everybody's sort of hunkered down in the trench, the plane kind of goes out the window. And that's essentially what happened from the point of the many years we put together from 2014 and that, well, Collins mentioned, the precursor to the Ebola that helped us on Ebola was the 9/11 and the avian flu. And Ebola kind of set the base, the platform for what the metro area, New Jersey, and New York was borrowing some of the ideas from New Jersey. And likewise, we were borrowing some of the COOP planning that they obviously were in the middle of during 9/11, right? So we were kind of using it because we knew that ahead of time that that area, ultimately New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, it didn't wind up being the worst hit by the pandemic at the end, as we see, but it was the first through the fire. So it kind of blew up bright red, right, as far as the United States was concerned. So plenty of mistakes were made, to go back to that military analogy, in terms of what was planned, and then ultimately what I mentioned and prefaced the discussion with, in terms of how this thing ultimately got operationalized through COVID. And so the four basic areas of Ebola were communication, which was key. Communication, communication, communication. I'm going to circle back to that in a minute. Collaboration, because we don't exist in a vacuum, right? We don't exist in a vacuum. The courts are basically loosely coupled with all these other social service agencies, the police, attorneys, health departments, all these kind of things. And the pandemic really just exacerbated. If there's any kind of gap, any kind of chasm that's going on in that communication or collaboration, a crisis is not going to conceal any of that. That gets concealed when things are going well, right? It's time, crisis, time and crisis. Well, kind of in any kind of relationship, actually, right? Time and crisis are those two things that kind of reveal everything, right? It kind of reminds me some sage advice I got when when I first got engaged to my wife. A colleague of mine says, there's two things that are going to show you, how that relationship goes: time and crisis, right? And so the kind of pandemic is kind of any kind of communication, collaboration in those kind of relationships are going to be revealed over time and crisis. It exacerbates those kind of things. Information technology, which wound up being critical and was not utilized probably as effectively as it should. It wasn't thought out all the way down the rabbit hole, really, with COVID-19 as what we initially planned in Ebola. And then finally, infrastructure issues that I'll talk about in terms of some of the basic kind of elements that some of the essential kind of things that you're going to need, like plexiglass and the ability to use ThinkPads and remote kind of things that you need from different locations. Right? Okay, so all of that sort of prepares the judiciary and the response to how they're going to once COVID-19 hits. So when COVID-19 initially hit, so I have family on 4 continents, right? So English is actually a second language to me. So I have a great deal of family who live, as you could probably guess from my first name, in Italy, right? So one of my favorite cousins, right? So I'm in regular communication with him. He's actually director of hospital administration in Monza, which is right outside of Milan. And so if you remember what happened with COVID-19, and you think of what happened in Milan, that was basically, the hotbed, right? It was China. COVID-19 was to China and then Italy to what Ebola was to Liberia and Sierra Leone, right? That's the kind of framework. And so I was constantly in kind of communication with him when it first hit in Italy and what he was experiencing in the hospital. And it was complete chaos. Complete chaos. Now, I knew from my experiences from 9/11 and from Ebola, oh boy, when this thing hits the United States, it's going to be bad, A, and B, New York, New Jersey are going to get hit first, and it's just going to be complete chaos. And that's exactly what it turned into, complete chaos. And if there was any kind of order, despite all those mistakes that were made, right? If there was any kind of order, it's because there was that baseline. You had something. You had something. And so the importance, I guess at the end of it, if there's one kind of lesson learned, there's so many, but there's one that we can kind of circle back to, would be that to have something. If you had a COOP plan, any kind of COOP plan, it was going to be helpful, right? Even if it wasn't 100% applicable. And so one of the interesting things, as I kind of, the sort of researcher in me, first thing as I started thinking about this, I said, well, let me think, the first person, Collins knows me, the first person I would have ordinarily gone to, I would have went to my mother. I said, what do you think? She's not a court administrator, just some random immigrant, right? Probably one of the brightest people I know, right? So my mother passed on, so I couldn't even go to her. But even if she were alive, I couldn't go to her because the last time anybody had ever experienced anything like this was in 1918, right? 100 years ago. And so what can we do? Well, thank God for Google, right? But Google wasn't even that reliable because there weren't that many things written about the 1918 flu. Why? Does anybody know why there's not a lot of history written about the 1918 flu? I found this. Anybody? The war was one of the reasons. Not so much lack of communication, not that they couldn't, but they what? Wouldn't. You know why they wouldn't? Because they were embarrassed of how they acted. And so the history of the 1918 pandemic was kind of what the cat does when it goes into the litter box. It kind of covers its mess. People were embarrassed by how they behaved because they were pleading with people in New York City, pleading with people to go into their homes where children had lost parents and the children were dying, starving to death, and people wouldn't go. So you have to hand it to the people who work in the hospitals, in the courts, that weren't running away. Those people are heroes. They are, truly, in every sense of the word, they are. Because a pandemic, what we've learned, as I'm sure you all know, it's a different type of crisis. It's worse than 9/11. It's worse than a terrorist attack, because when there's a terrorist attack, there's a beginning, middle, and end. People go, they take their shirts off, they run. As Colin said, everybody's going. In a pandemic, everybody goes in, 99% of the people are going in the opposite direction. It's every man, woman, and literally child for themselves. And that's why you don't see so much history about the 1918 flu. People were embarrassed of how they behaved, and so there's not a lot of history. So we couldn't even rely on it. But there are some things, it's kind of that commercial, the more things change, the more they stay the same. These are some things I found online, which I found really sort of fascinating. We had the anti-maskers even back then, and we had the movement to wear a mask. Wash your hands, wear a mask, social distance. With all the advancements of healthcare, those three things basically, we came round robin, right? So it's kind of like a double-edged sword, this kind of healthcare technology and the advancements we made, because it kind of created the problem that we have, right? But at the same time, it also created the cure, right? The vaccine created in record time, right? This is an open-air police court in San Francisco, Portsmouth, San Francisco. So what does this tell you? We can't close shop. We're one of the people that when the pandemic happens, you work for the court, you're in it. You can't run home. You can't run away. The courts have to, if you want society to continue, then you got to stay. You can't run away. And so this is from 1918. They're having an open air, fascinating thing, police court. I never heard of such a thing, but it existed. So to maintain sort of social distancing and those kind of things. So Collins mentioned, here's one key piece. So we're giving you lots and lots of slides. They're going to be available online. We're going to gloss over some of the things, but I really wanted to give you as much detailed information regarding all of this, right? So you have sort of a full kind of comprehensive kind of review of it. And so I gave you both. So we're giving you both the sort of the stages of Ebola and then how it sort of compares, medically speaking, with COVID. The big difference, why the COOP plan wound up getting operationalized in COVID and it didn't in Ebola for the most part, is because of where you see symptoms there. You see where it says symptoms day 1? And right here, where it says patient can be infectious 2 days before symptoms show. Those 2 days made all the difference. And thankfully, COVID wasn't as lethal as Ebola. Because if COVID was as lethal as Ebola, it would have been a completely, entirely different kind of experience, as bad as COVID was. So the saving grace that we should all walk away with is, how do we prepare if the patient winds up being infectious 2 days before symptoms show? So you could be sick but not know it. That's how it passes. And that chain of transmission, right, once it's broken, you're done. And that's what happened in Italy. Though the chain of transmission in Italy was broken, and it didn't make a difference at that point where you can, to contain the people. The subject matter experts were telling the Trump administration that. Now, whether or not they wanted to listen to it is entirely different, but they were telling the administration that. It's like, look, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when, how fast. It's already here in the United States. You could close everything down. The world is a small place. It's over. It's going to be here. It's just a matter, you can't contain it anymore because the chain of transmission has been broken. So when Collins and I were in the courts and we were discussing, and this Spencer and then the nurse that was wound up being quarantined by the governor in New Jersey, Governor Christie, who wound up suing the state afterwards for a violation of our constitutional rights. That's why we had to really sort of be familiar with what are the courts allowed to do, not allowed to do, what does the case law say, and nobody in the courts knows, right? Because the judges, the staff, no one knows. You have to kind of go through and figure it all out. So when I was having the discussion with Collins, and in his wisdom, he said that to me then when I was preparing the courts in that COOP in Essex County. I said, you know, we're going to wind up, if this thing winds up happening, Essex is going to be at the center, right? Where we do about 40% more in case filings than any other county. It's that much. We do about then we were doing about 150, 160,000 felony filings a year, right? Pretty large. You know, not the largest in the country, probably top 15 though. So he made the observation is let us proceed as though it's already here. Ebola is already in New Jersey. Let's proceed with that kind of assumption. And so that 2 days before symptoms show is really, it was the key kind of thing that kind of separated COVID from Ebola. That ultimately made it a pandemic. It's just that small kind of narrow time frame. And so I've given you some data here to show where New Jersey kind of stacked up with New York. As I mentioned, they were kind of like the states that were sort of at the epicenter. I say epicenter because they were the first through the fire, right? So everyone could kind of use them as a model in terms of what was coming down the pike, right? So as New Jersey, right, and administration, judges, and staff were kind of looking overseas to Italy, the other states could then look to New Jersey, New York to say, okay, what are they doing, right? How are they proceeding? And so this is where it went basically within an 8-9 month period. And then it projected deaths by state in 2020 up to the past summer where they were. Ultimately, I'll show you where they ended up. New Jersey, New York ended up in the top 10, but weren't the worst states at this point. I mean, the numbers are still coming in, but ultimately that's, you'll take a look to see where they end up. And so this is where California, Texas, and Florida really round out the top 3. Okay, so this is as of basically the data collected as of April of 2021. So you see they're still in the top 10 there, but they didn't fare as bad as some of the other states. So there are surges, and if you think of the pandemic in terms of how New Jersey, New York looked, it kind of looked like a capital A, right? It kind of went like this. It peaked, chaos, and then it kind of went down, where other states kind of went like this, sort of plateaued a bit, maybe had another blip, and then it kind of went down. Actually, let me just get a quick review. What states are you all from? I mean, it's a small enough session. Arizona, Oregon, Northwest, Utah. Jen, I know Arizona. Washington, Vermont, Illinois, California. Oh, so you're the winner. Congratulations. Idaho.
And in New Orleans?
Anyone from New Orleans? Louisiana? In the back? Georgia. Colorado. Nevada. Oh, another winner. Good. Michigan. Anybody from Florida, Texas? So from our friends in California, then, we could learn from all of you now, right? Certainly, I'm sure you have plenty of stories to share. So when COVID, so we use Ebola, as I said, as that baseline, right? It kind of hits the fan with COVID, and so now you fully operationalize what the COOP is going to look like. And so one of the first things, remember I talked to you about the loosely coupled kind of system that the courts find themselves in. So one of the things that we're going to first want to look at is, okay, who are we going to partner with? Well, you're going to partner with the people who could give you some direction. How bad is the pandemic? What are the projected kind of excess deaths? What should we do in terms of sanitation? What are the kind of rules? What are the kind of preventative kind of things we need to do? Because the courts have to move on, right? We have to move and keep society. There's some sort of order and due process. All that has to be balanced out. So what are we going to do? So we consult with the Department of Health, right? A key piece, really a kind of a centerpiece in terms of what's going to guide our direction, our management. And then we're going to activate COOP, right? Kind of push the red button, and we focus on the 19 critical functions that the courts are responsible for. What ultimately happens in a pandemic, though, is while we're focused on critical functions, it can't just be critical functions because it's going out for as far as we don't know. So we have to handle non-critical functions too. That's another lesson that I'll circle back to. And what we do is we talk about critical functions as an executive component, the judicial side of things and the staff management side of things. So we divide the administrative functions, what am I responsible for as a practitioner and professional, and what do the judges need to do on their end. And then we come together with the committee of those folks that are responsible in accordance to all these different things. Now, one of the things we did that helped us in Ebola, and then it was expanded in New Jersey, fortunately, right? It wasn't perfect, but we had it, which was helpful, was this. It was a COOP report repository. So we were able to share information across the state based on what everybody was doing. What worked, what didn't work, who were the essential critical people, right? We assigned them passwords so they can go in and take a look at each. I don't know if you all could see it, but you could see all our corporate documents related to budgeting, related to cash management, the classification of staff, facilities management, labor relations, our Title IV funding, all of our functions, everything that was required, all the documentation, training manuals, the bench manuals, everything that we used for the COOP was available centrally to everybody. They had a user ID and a password. They can go in there. If they had any questions, they were able to go in on their own. And we sort of expanded on that, including training videos and demos. So they took what we did initially as an IT kind of platform and expanded on it once COVID hit. So the recovery plan that we had, I showed you, had prioritized functions, basic things. It's obviously a lot more detailed than what I've shared with you here, but essentially it had those 19 critical functions that were separated in accordance to that executive component, judicial, administrative areas. It had who are the critical personnel? So Collins mentioned to you, you can't mistake just because a person is in the position of leadership does not mean that they have the capacity of leadership, right? I could occupy the chair, but it doesn't make me a leader. It just means I'm occupying the chair, right? So the pandemic, anytime you have a crisis, remember I mentioned time and crisis, you have a crisis, you kind of see the person's true colors at that point. And so we've set up who are the critical personnel, who are the kind of people we rely on. From the mailroom clerk, because mail's coming in, who's taking care of that? Who's willing to do it? How are we going to train that person? Simple stuff that we couldn't overlook, all the way up to the assignment judge or presiding judge, right? Chief judge of the court. Essential materials. What do we need, right? What do we need to function in the documentation, in the infrastructure, in the IT? And this was a huge thing, alternate locations. So what we learned, apart from communication being key, what was critical, huge mistake from Ebola to COVID, is if I have a crisis, if my court, when we had Hurricane Sandy, we had a huge flood once. We had Hurricane Sandy. We had that huge windstorm with Hurricane Irene, where an entire complex got shut down. Our family court, busiest building in our complex, shuts down. No problem. Operate the COOP. A couple hiccups here and there, a couple wrinkles. No problem. We move them to a different location. We'll run for the hills in Morris County, right? We'll do something. Biggest mistake that wasn't conceived as thoroughly, as comprehensively as it should be. What if you have no place to go? Not just here in the state, any place in the world. Where are you going? So what we learned really in COVID is that the alternate location 1 and 2, there were no alternate locations. So how do we function into this virtual kind of universe? So with great crisis, folks, right, comes great lessons, right? And in those great lessons, it's experience, right? And Michael Jordan used to say, right, I made a mistake, I keep making mistakes, and that's why I'm successful. And so the pandemic, with all the mistakes that were made, ultimately, success is there, and we've learned a great deal from it. And there's some benefits that we'll learn, I'll get to in a minute. So we broke this down as a 1-day plan, 1-week plan, 30-day plan with Ebola. But in COVID, what do we do when we don't know? So 2 big issues were, we have no place to run, we have no courthouse, quote unquote, and 2, how long won't we have a courthouse? So the plan is talking about, where's this 30-day+ plan? A year, 18 months, 2 years. What if it's Ebola on that symptom kind of scale? What do we do the next time, right? And as all of us in the courts, professionally speaking, we should be thinking, what do we do for the next pandemic? None of us in this room, right, should be thinking, oh, this is not going to be my problem ever again. The next time they have this is going to be 100 years from now. No way. No way. This is not 1918. I would, as Collins would say, let's assume we're going to get hit with something 2 years from now, 5 years from now, and it'll be worse. That's what a good manager does. Prepare for that kind of thing. And so when you're talking about your recovery plan, that's what we should be doing. And so one of the things we did in New Jersey, you'll see that from 2014, they learned some lessons from that. So they built, by 2017, there was a change, and they had some criminal justice system reform. This is a kind of a silver lining in that Ebola kind of experience, is that they extended virtual proceedings that were being done on Saturdays in criminal court, critical. They expanded it to other case types. So family, the corporate one, civil, right? General equity. So they expanded it to other case types. And that helped them eliminate in-person proceeding as early as March. So we knew what was happening, right, in February. So it helped them basically within 30, 45 days to really start shifting everything into that direction. it was, so you didn't know. Basically, it's serendipitous, honestly. It's that little exposure that we had with planning in Ebola that helped them make those kind of reforms that wound up proving really sort of critical, right? And this is not without error. So you can imagine if they didn't even have that little kind of preparation, what would have happened. I mentioned this before. It bears repeating that while there were those 19 critical functions, it's all fine and good. But you can't expect people, if it's non-critical, non-essential, right, being a responsible purposes and responsibilities of the courts, as Ernie Friesen talked about, you know, a forum for dispute resolution. Well, maybe not critical, but we still got to get it done. We still have to get it done. This thing can't go on forever, right? People have to come back. And then you have to think, if we don't do it, what happens when people ultimately come back? If we've ignored all these people, 2 years, 3 years before we get our bearings and we're coming back, what do? We're going to have a backlog for how long, right? And this is the United States, mind you. And having traveled extensively with Collins all over the planet, for all the mistakes that the United States makes, right, it's still looked at as a beacon, nicely, right? It's still looked as a beacon. So we have a responsibility, frankly. It's that serious, right? People are looking to the United States as a model, particularly when it comes to its judicial system, right? So we can't just ignore these people. And so one of the other key pieces is we're training the judges. We're training the judges in those remote formats. And so here are some of the practical kind of things that New Jersey and our colleagues in New York did in preparation of those remote functions. Is they had, thankfully, because they were able to build on that reform that was done 3 years prior in 2017, 95% of the judges and staff were working from home by the end of the month. They were able to very quickly move with that format. The platforms that they were used, Zoom, Scopia, MS Teams, Polycom, probation, pretrial service officers were trained in the pandemic protocols, just like, and they were trained by healthcare personnel in terms of best practices. Again, that collaboration with those justice system stakeholders. Healthcare became central. Community service, quick story. Community service. So how do we do community service with some of our ISP personnel? You know, one of the things that they did is they helped make masks. They were sewing. They were sewing masks. That was part of community service. They were helping the hospitals as a part of community service. So where there's a will, there's a way. Creative approaches to still kind of doing the work, the very important work of the courts. Motions, appeals, status conferences. While trials are suspended, all those other events, right, were able to still go remotely. There was a learning curve, of course, right? But, you know, after a month, 2 months, people then start to realize, you know, human beings are creatures of habit. Once you, what do they say about change? It's, you know, that bridge, but once you go from point A to point B, once you're at point B, right, it's not the change, that's it. It's not the change, it's the transition. But once you make that transition, right, and people become acquainted with these different types of platforms, then it becomes easier. So between mid-March and the end of April, so in about a 45-day period, they did 18,000 court events, and with over 130,000 court participants. Some quick anecdotes in terms of what they did. Judges, there was a judge that we were talking about, and she conducted a wedding outside of the courthouse because I forget now if it was the man or the woman. One of the folks got diagnosed with cancer and needed health care. And so it's an emergency. That's an emergency. So it's like, the judge is doing a wedding. That's not essential. That doesn't fall on the critical, that's not on the 19 critical functions. It's not essential doing weddings. But for this, it's critical. So she did the wedding outside, social distancing, put it on the record so that the other spouse who got diagnosed with cancer could get the health care. in the middle of a pandemic. A New Hampshire couple, right, who had fostered, was providing foster care for this 3-year-old boy, could not travel to New Jersey to adopt the baby, but were able to do so through virtual proceeding. Adoption, not essential. But in a pandemic, you can't think that way. So we're able to do the adoptions virtually. We had a court employee stuck in Puerto Rico, critical for interpreting. We were able to provide service from Puerto Rico for child protection hearings remotely from that individual's parents' home. She couldn't leave because I think one of the parents was sick, because COVID obviously struck them pretty hard as well. And I'm struck with this. I was talking to the judge who was doing, who did the wedding, and she said, it kind of struck me. She said, I said, Judge, how are we holding up? In our discussions, Collins and I discussion with all these different personnel over the past year and a half, and talking to what they're doing and how we could use this experience as a model for some of the kind of some of our foreign colleagues. So she said, well, the hours feel like days, and the days feel like weeks, and the weeks feel like months because of the learning curve. And it's exhausting. It is exhausting because you're worried about your own self, right, as well. And so it's what a year this week has been. Okay, so some of the universal kind of lessons that are learned is, I mentioned this before, communication, communication, communication. Communication has to be key. So who's the authority? Don't assume that just because the person is sitting in the leadership chair is going to be the leader in a pandemic type of situation. They may be the first ones to run for the hills. With not even as Colin said, not even taking the robe off. It would be like one of these characters with the robe kind of going this way, right?
It happened. It's a real story.
That's a real story. The judge jumped off the bench on the record and ran. And the court clerk is there. Can you imagine such a thing? Yes, you could. Yes, I'm sure. Well, yes. So who's in charge? What's the message? Is it clear? What's the protocol? Where are we going to communicate what the employees need to know? What are the regular updates? And this is huge because in Nigeria, we give wings to misinformation when we share fake news. You got to stop the fake news. What is the real? So we have to rely, here's the portal, where's the information? So that repository, that information was used there. What are the protocols? What is the information? Partnerships, particularly with the Department of Health, right? So we're not going to be the experts on those protocols, but we can build on them. We can have constant communication because as the pandemic changed, so does the protocols, Masks good, masks not good, masks good, masks not good, right? I mentioned this to you before in terms of the measures that have to be taken when the chain of transmission is still intact. Here's the thing. In this respect, the courts could be proactive, but in many respects, it has to be reactive because what we learned in Italy was that once that chain of transmission is broken, it's over. It's over. You can't stop it at that point. The best you can do is try to contain it. And that's only going to be for a finite period of time. So it's going to be critical. And now, basically, what we learned from this pandemic and the world being such a small place and we all being as mobile as we are, those measures to take while that chain of transmission has to be done very quickly in the very beginning. Prevention obviously means avoiding contact. And so the case law that we built on, and there's more case law that's coming in, if you do a search, you'll see and we gave you some of those case law factors as kind of an overview. But you'll see that the prevention means avoiding contact. The difference is between quarantining and isolation. Got COOP. Yes?
I have one question about
Sure.
spreading the news for staff. How much information is too much information, and how much is not enough?
That's a great question, Collins.
Try to calm down we're not coming back until next year, we're not coming back until next week, or they're calling us back tomorrow morning.
Well, what we did is constant consultations. I mean, you can't, nobody knows until you know. I mean, some of the judges were the ones saying, why do we need a coup plan? Why don't we just shut down and go home? We had that discussion.
Yeah.
And my chief judge at the time, she would put me out there. She'd keep quiet and let me fight it out with the judges. So I said, well, we can't, we're special. We can't go home. That's what I said. I said, we're special. We're between anarchy and civilization, so we can't go home. And we simply avoided those judges who are not willing to, because it's not going to do anything to them. So the plan went around them, because we're not really in full session, so you can do without a quarter of your bench at the time. But the information thing is, we control information very seriously in the courts in New Jersey, because we don't want to be quoted by the newspaper. We don't express our personal views as court employees. So that helped. And then we were sharing the information we think we need to know on a regular basis. So that was it. That was really the approach, but nobody knows.
Here's a similar kind of situation in terms of information, right? Sometimes giving the information is better than not giving the information because of this. It's going to get to them, but you get to control the accuracy of that information. Case in point, in 2008, when we had the Great Recession, the Chief Justice then sent us an email to said, our budget at the AOC is we have liaisons with the AOC collaborating with legislators, but we should start preparing for a 10% workforce reduction. He sent an email to the TCAs and to some of the lead people in operations. So Collins and I, we get together and we're thinking about what we're going to do, the 10% reduction in possible layoffs across the entire state, and how we're going to plan accordingly. We have one meeting, us, and then there was a couple of presiding judges, right, and the assignment judge. So it was small, maybe a dozen people. The next morning, so this was on a Friday. The weekend goes, Monday morning, I'm in the elevator. I'm going up to the office. A guy comes into the elevator with me and says, "Hey, Joe, are they going to think about seniority with these layoffs?" This is not one of my management colleagues. This is a guy he was like a team leader. So like a team leader. So he was like frontline supervisor. He had a team, right? But he wasn't all the way up the chain, but not all the way down. I said, "Where did you? Who said that to you?" He goes, "Well, I was taking the bus, and I was having a conversation with Norma, who's like a court clerk, and she's all worried, and she's talking to me. This is Monday morning. He's taken public transportation to the court from Friday to Monday. Completely inaccurate information. His mind is going off into a different orbit. Who knows with the court clerk what trajectory now she's going on?" Collins gets back to the office. He's got 2 phone calls from different people asking to meet with him about the possible layoffs, what they're going to do. They got a family to feed. What am I going to do? I've been here 30 years. I got no place to go. So information is funny.
And just to follow up on that,
now put that in a pandemic where people's lives are at stake.
Joe, remember what I was telling you about my meeting with the Chief Justice of Guyana about 4 weeks ago, or maybe 5 weeks ago, because they were still trying to open their courts. And I was there finishing a project, and so she asked me, what do we do? How do I open these courts? Because, and they were really, at the time I was there, and I had about 3 folks working there for 8 weeks. About 12 of their employees had COVID at the same time, so they were afraid of a big exposure issue. So I brought up a COOP plan. I said, what do if you do consulting, the worst thing you can do is to offer advice and services that they didn't ask you. So I hold back. I said, do you have a plan? He said, no. So I said, we need to do X, Y, Z. So I met with her. I put together a little draft of a simple plan. What are the essential functions? And she needed to meet with the judges. I said, no, don't give too much information. I said, no. Don't give too. This is what you need to say for now, and get the feedback and bring some key people. The next day, we had a meeting. And I was still in that country. It was in the newspaper that the woman is insensitive, is trying to reopen the courts, and it was two different publications. And thankfully, I left town that night.
So the COOP is important, and it's a great point in terms of the information. So me, having experienced that anecdote that I've shared with you in terms of the Great Recession, and then now it being exacerbated with this kind of experience we had, the pandemic, is I prefer to be in a position where I control my own destiny, right? So I'm going to share information accurately, right? And be really kind of the leader that you ought to be. So people have sort of had that sounding board. So continuing on with COOP. So one of the saving graces is that there was not a perfect plan. There's no perfect, right? So you just have to have a plan, though, something to build on. And then you kind of maneuver from there. The COOP built around alternate locations, failure. And so pandemics of any magnitude have to build a COOP, a specialized kind of COOP around the pandemic, has to build around, apart from the communication that I mentioned is key, has to build around no location. And so the courts have to start really kind of making those critical arguments to their state legislatures about the budgeting that has to go into creating these virtual kind of courtrooms in light of the pandemic. No one should assume that it's going to be another 100 years before we experience, and sort of kicking that can down the road. The courts really should then, therefore, have strong argument now with the data showing that, hey, we're frontline people here. You can't shut the courts down. You have to fund it, budget it in a way where these things can move forward, because you're going to be relying on the courts. So when there's complete pandemonium in the street and people need someplace to go, they're going to be able to still rely on the courts. Because if the courts shut down completely and they have no place to go, you're really going to have unrest. And so this is another key point. The judge had mentioned this to me about the training that she went through and the training that I went through prior to Ebola was the tabletop exercises. But those tabletop exercises talked about like floods and hurricanes and those kind of things. The tabletop exercises that they should develop really should be specialized, specific toward pandemics. And prior to COVID, you didn't have them, at least not in my experience, in our discussion. Because as I mentioned to you, everybody runs for the hills. Pandemic is a different type of crisis. And so therefore, there should be a tabletop exercise with all those Department of Health, the sheriff, the attorneys, fire department, everybody who's coming to a tabletop exercise should be specialized in saying what's their role, how are we going to communicate, what we're going to do around the pandemic, right? Actually, when I was in, there was a gentleman, he used to be the trial court administrator in Wisconsin. Then he was a trial court administrator in Monmouth. He's in a completely different now. But he was in my ICM class with the National Center for State Courts back in 2008. And his ICM project, I remembered, there was probably about 25, 30 of us in that class. But his ICM project was on pandemics. And I never even heard of pandemic before that experience that I sat in that classroom with him. And I remember I had still his contact information, so I called him. I says, I'm thinking about your fellowship paper. And I went online and I read it end to end, because that was the only kind of source of information. It was one of the first sources of information I was able to look at to really sort of get a grasp, because people are like, pandemic, what the heck? What is that? Special kind of crisis, that's what that is. Special kind of crisis, special kind of leadership, special kind of plan, right? And universal kind of lessons that we all could learn from with all the mistakes that we've made. Updated technological capacities and the opportunities. This is an opportunity. In a crisis, any kind of experience provides you with an opportunity to get better, to be better. So at the end of all this, right, the courts should be in a position to build on the opportunities, frankly. I don't want to call them mistakes. Let's call them opportunities to learn from what we've done here. So we could now maybe say we could shift some of the things that we're doing in the courts permanently to a virtual setting. So it'll be seamless then in the next pandemic. Completely seamless, right? The working from home concept, maybe there are some things that never have to come back. So we completely reduce permanently that courthouse footprint. Not a bad idea. Not a bad idea at all. Pandemic procedures versus what we do following the pandemic, right? So what struck me really is this balance that has to go. Due process is balanced against the issues that are confronted with the pandemic. Allowing the courts more flexibility in how litigants can file different types of orders, unemployment, domestic violence, restraining orders, those kind of things. The legislation, the laws surrounding statute of limitations, I think have to be reviewed in special kind of crisis kind of points when it comes to pandemic. And then templates. Part of that, the documentation in that COOP repository that I shared, having templates in there for the judges to kind of very quickly go through with special kind of session orders. We're canceling all jury management, for instance, right? Special session orders that speak to those kind of special circumstances. And now what do we do once we're over the hump? Where are we now? So we're rounding third. Jude was saying, he was saying rounding second. I said, no, I'm more optimistic. We're rounding third, right? Right? Don't go backwards, right? Like the Yankees. So, that's my team, the Yankees. You could understand my disappointment. But it's okay, because Italy won the Euro Cup yesterday, so we're good. So, we have a report. So, we don't want to be in 1918. We made plenty of mistakes. That's okay. Let's embrace the mistakes, right? Michael Jordan, I make lots of mistakes. That's why I'm successful. We embrace them. We embrace those mistakes. We're going to report it. We're going to document the things that we did that didn't go really according to plan. There's no shame in the man in the arena or the woman in the arena. There's no shame in it. Reintegrating. How are we going to quell the concerns of staff who are legit scared to come back to the courthouse? How are we going to determine, because there's going to be a backlog, in some dockets more than less. What are the overtime compensatory time for managing that backlog? How are we going to now handle sick policy, right? So now, I was in a restaurant in Old Town yesterday, and there was a line there, and my wife is in the line, and I'm with my two sons, and we're there, and somebody sneezed on the line, and you would have thought like a bomb went off. People are like this. So it kind of had me thinking about this sick policy. You got to think about now when people come back and people are sort of have allergies, or there's some dust in the air, somebody sneezes and coughing, people are going to want to run. I've got to go home. They're going to get scared. So think about the sick policy, and sort of rethinking, if you're sick and you're nauseous, really don't come. Don't come. Stay home. What if staff are exposed? What do we do? What's the protocol, policy? Those things have to be rethought. Masks and basic infrastructure. So one of my core areas is in operations. So this is the kind of stuff I really could like to sink my teeth into, right? The policy and procedure and linking it up with some of the data pieces. Plexiglass barriers. You see it here at NACM, right? At registration. Social distancing signage. What are the housekeeping? Hand sanitizer dispensers. Absolutely. Absolutely. On-site temperature screenings. Not a bad idea. Give it to the sheriff. Right? And then I saw this picture I saw at a truck stop. I think it's fantastic. So a great universal lesson, right? wash your hands, right? And my mom used to say this, it was like, wash your hands, you know? You should do that regardless if there's, you know, a virus, the worldwide virus going around. And then on a more serious note, I'd like to conclude with this, is I like, and Collins mentioned it, we're special, 100%. Courts are special. So when I think of all of our collective experience around the country, right, and the experiences we're all like to share with one another, in terms of where the courts are, I like to think of this Martin Luther King Jr. quote, is out of a mountain of despair, a stone of hope. And make no mistake about it, that's what the courts are. That's what the courts were in this pandemic. We're hope, right? We're hope. People look to the court and say there's order. Even in a crisis, there's order. As long as the courts are there, there's order. It may look a little, there's some havoc. Got a good, solid purpose or responsibility, those earth things, there's going to be hope. And that's that's really all you need, frankly, to move forward. That's some of our contact information. I thank you all for attending the session. We'll take any kind of questions you may have or any sort of final comments. I appreciate, most of all, I appreciate you showing up this early. This is fantastic.
Thank you.